I am excited to welcome on the stage Meredith Tromble, who is the Associate Professor from San Francisco Art Institute, in discussion with J.D. Beltran and Scott Minneman from the California College of Arts, who are also exhibiting here at the event, and Rhonda Holberton from San Jose University. Let's welcome them. Thank you.
Scott, we're being in the order of the slide.
I think so. It does mean a major shuffle.
And then you're third. You're where Rhonda's sitting right now, and then Rhonda's at the front.
Huh?
We're in the order of the slide. So you know I'm third. Yeah. Here. There. Yeah, okay.
This had this fabulous idea that we can arrange ourselves in the order of our slides to tell us apart.
Well, these slide. Yeah.
I'm going to start by introducing everybody, and then we'll get underway with some, perhaps some even more interesting talk and images. I am Meredith Tromble, an artist and writer working at the intersections of art, science, and technology. I've been an artist in residence at the UC Davis Complexity Sciences Center for the past 7 years, working as a serial collaborator with the geobiologist Don Sumner, the other scientists there, and the choreographer Donna Sternberg, whose company is based in Los Angeles. We just debuted a performance called The Vortex in Los Angeles a week ago, and I came running back here to talk to people about teaching art and technology, and where I teach at the San Francisco Art Institute, where I've spent a lot of time working on curriculum. J.D. Beltran is a conceptual artist, designer, filmmaker, writer, and educator. Her award-winning work, which blends the narrative and abstract in investigating how material tells stories, has been screened and exhibited internationally, including at the Walker Art Center, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Getty Center, and a very long list of other prestigious national and international festivals and museums. Many of her projects have also been in collaboration with Scott Minneman, who's sitting right here. They achieved the International New Technological Art Award in 2014, and their collaboration, The Magic Story Table, was recognized as one of the top interactive designs in 2010 by ID Magazine. And JD's also a writer. She has written columns on art and culture for both SF Gate and the Huffington Post, and is a member of the San Francisco Writers Grotto. And she's got so many other fabulous points on her resume that I'm not going to read them all to you, because I want to have time to tell you about Scott, who is an engineering designer whose work probes the intersection of collaborative practices, emerging technology, and new forms of storytelling. He holds degrees from MIT and Stanford, and as well as 12 or so U.S. patents. He worked at the famed Palo Alto Research Center, PARC, beginning as a student intern, and then working in a variety of research capacities over 15 years there, always focusing on designing and prototyping novel systems that demonstrate the potential for using new technologies in real use settings. He's collaborated on art installations at SIGGRAPH, the Ansel Adams Center for Photography, and the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. And when he left PARC in 2001, he co-founded Onami Labs, where he's the creative principal and the chief technical and chief executive onomist. You'll have to ask him what that is. They meld art, engineering, science, and design methodologies to produce highly novel interactive devices, which can be found all over the world in Singapore, Mexico City, Disneyland, the Baltimore City Planning Department, probably the opposite of Disneyland, I'm guessing, and the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and again, lots of other wonderful places. And last but not least is Rhonda Holberton, an Oakland-based artist whose multimedia installations make use of digital and interactive technologies integrated into traditional methods of art production. She holds an MFA from Stanford University and a BFA from the California College of Arts, and she is now an assistant professor of digital media arts at San Jose State University. She was a, do I say Kamak? Artist in residence at Marnay-sur-Seine. My French is terrible, I'm sorry, in France, and was awarded a Fondation Tenno Fellowship in Paris. She's been exhibiting all over the place. She has a show that just opened in New York, and you have something up also at Art Market this weekend, I believe. So there will be many opportunities to see her work as well. And I'll mention that Scott and JD have 3 pieces here in the festival. So now that you know who we are, let's move on to what we're going to talk about. Let's see if I understand the technology well enough to get our slides advancing. As opposed. No, that will be sad.
Oh, here, we got it.
Okay.
He's right there.
Oh.
There you go. Just,
Oh, thank you. Okay. Yeah, so that was a good example of teaching art at a tech school where I, for one, am always learning things from my students. But I thought I would just begin to just set our topic of why teaching tech is relevant to teaching contemporary art. Just to mention that contemporary artists use tech for all the things that artists have always used their materials for. And this is a public art piece by Jennifer Steinkamp called Winter Fountains. Steinkamp and many others have done amazing full-scale projections as public art, which is simply a new form of providing a forum or images that bring people together or express something about how they feel collectively. Artists use art and technology to reflect on the mysteries of life. This is Jane Prophet's work, Neuro Memento Mori, which is based on 17th century tradition of still life, memento moris, thinking about the fact that we're alive and dying all at the same time, always. And they use art and technology for satire and critique. This is a detail showing the god Atom from Nathaniel Mellors and Erika Niesenen's The Alto Natives, which is a wonderful satirical installation on the pratfalls that we can take with new technology, which are very important to remember, along with all the marvelous successes. And they use technology to facilitate all kinds of traditional practices, as with this work by the painter Amy Ellingson, whose very labor-intensive, handcrafted encaustic paintings are sketched using digital means in the computer, and then in this case, refabricated in a ceramic medium using digital fabrication processes to make an installation that you might have seen in the international terminal at the San Francisco airport. So yeah, it looks very different. Scott, your slides are supposed to come up next, so I think I'll hand this off to you. Okay. I'll give that to him to figure out while I say my last few.
Somebody else is driving at this point.
Yeah.
I'm just watching.
While I say my last few words of introduction. So, since contemporary artists are using digital art techniques in such an amazing variety of ways, there's also an amazing variety of teaching experiences that we have interacting with this. And we're going to open with Scott's discussion on art, technology, and material.
Okay, so as you might have, whoops, that was supposed to be play. Ah, come on. Can you,
Press enter. Go. Yeah,
that's not me.
now the arrow. There we go.
Whenever I hit forward, I'm getting... Oh, okay. Well, let's try down.
There we go. There we go.
There
Down.
we go. Okay, got it. So let's see. As you heard in the intro, I'm trained as a architect and mechanical engineering designer, and I teach in the MFA program at California College of the Arts. And my opening gambit, kind of set up by Meredith, is that technology is a material. It's just a material these days. We kind of could think of it as something equivalent to paint or clay, and it's to be harnessed for artistic expression. It's not just screens and sensors and little bits of electronics, although they're a basis of a lot of what JD and I do together on the technological sense, but other pieces of material as well. This is a piece I collaborated with Sam Lewitt on a while back. We made these sheet heaters, probably about 100 times larger than they normally are made, and they were designed to plug in directly to the track lighting system in the gallery. It was a show called More Heat Than Light, and then I also made these little sensors for his piece. This is another piece I collaborated on where we motorized Camille Bleitrix's sculpture. It basically was robotically trying to get out of the gallery by running itself into the wall. The technology for me includes not just electronics of screens and circuits, but also robotics and other bits of getting up against hard physics. These technologies sometimes coalesce into technological forms that I kind of identify as genres that we can then tune for artistic expression or aesthetic expression. And we'll return to this one, which was a museum piece that my company did. In turn, those genres become, as meaning-making conventions, slowly transform culture. And you can think of kind of the urban screens movement as something that started commercial, but also had an artistic side. This was a piece of interactive fiction we did in 1997 on Sunset Boulevard that passing motorists and pedestrians could control with their garage door openers. If you think back that far, there weren't cell phones. There weren't other means of connecting with public screens. So we kind of amplified the piece of technology that they would have on their person. Pedagogically, as educators, I think we want to teach our students how to engage with technology. We don't teach it per se. So, we get our students to kind of think through how to think about technology, how to work with technology. This was a student of mine who was thinking about how easy it is with one-click shopping to kind of lose control of their personal finances. And I was kind of like, well, is this really a thing? And then, we see something like Jeff Bezos accidentally buying Whole Foods. So yes, apparently being very easy to buy things is a problem. So this button made people press the one-click buying button hard and for a long time in order to make a purchase, depending on how far out of line that purchase was from some of their personal spending goals. And so it's we see our students taking technology and using it for very interesting ends that kind of push on the traditional kind of commercial uses of technology. I also try, one of my other hats is I'm an affiliate researcher at the Institute for the Future. So I'm a futurist and thinking about things that are going to happen sometime in the next decade. So I try to get my students to think about some of those things, and some of them are pretty well-known: artificial intelligence, robotics, conversational computing. But other speculations, and this isn't just a speculation, this is a company that is working to have a kind of wearable, functional magnetic resonant imaging system in the next decade. What you can do with that is that you can basically read what people are thinking. And if you tie two of these together, you can kind of run this thing in backwards and you get pretty close to telepathy. So sometime in the next decade or so, telepathy is going to be possible, technologically augmented telepathy. And we need to be thinking about what these things mean in our worlds and, what are we doing? So thinking about the ethics and getting our students to think about that when they're thinking about technology. And the challenges we want to pose to our students are how to operate near the cutting edge of technology, to think about how the world could be different. This was a project one of my student teams did it was a dumpling school, right? And they figured out that every culture has dumplings. And so it can be this kind of vehicle of technological and cultural exchange. And so they prototyped this whole activity and all the branding and everything that would go around with it. So again, just trying to think of technologies outside the box. So a bunch of provocations we can talk about during the Q&A.
Okay, down arrow. Oops. Which arrow is it?
This.
That one, sorry. Okay. So I'm not sure how I can start this. There we go. Just play it again. So what I'm going to talk about also is that not only do we have the complex system of new technologies coming up every month, every year, every day, but we also have the problem of the bar, meaning learning these technologies to be able to wrangle them into some sort of art form, something interesting. Right now I'm playing the video of my very first new media collaboration, and it was with the MIT Media Lab, and it was essentially an early touchscreen before touchscreens existed. And it's a projection that they coded to essentially have the knowledge to know exactly which spot on this giant screen you were tapping on through sound, through triangulation of sound. I could not have done this. This is probably, if it was purchased, it would probably be an $80,000 art piece in terms of all the technology that went into it. But because it was a collaboration with MIT Media Lab and grad students, I was able to do it. It was actually a self-portrait based on telephone messages, and you never saw me, but you just heard my messages to know about my life. And each one of those spots on the interface was a trigger spot for you to hear a set of messages. Scott showed the Tilty table. He first was using that in his as a map table. That was probably the best way of describing it is that it would be a more creative version of Google Earth. So instead of using your mouse to scroll and to go across Google Earth, you actually use the table as a big dial. And what we did was we made an art piece out of that, which was technically technology for maps, and we added content by harvesting stories from different cities around the world and then mapping them by geolocating where they happened and then adding a layer of film and text and sound to create our magic story table. That prior slide was kids in Kyrgyzstan. It was shown at the National Kyrgyz Museum. And we got all of these wonderful stories from people in Bishkek. And when you would turn the table, you would actually zoom in on a particular story and where it happened and hear them telling it in their voice, and then you would see a short film. This is in St. Petersburg, where it also traveled. I also wanted to talk about collaboration in terms of sound. So this is Dave Ajou, and he and I were commissioned to do a piece for Pacific Standard Time, which the very first iteration in 2012. And so what he did, and this was a bit unusual, he actually created a whole 20-minute sound piece. And then I, following the sound piece, actually made the images for it. Every single beat of sound, every single beat of his music. So it's in 4 movements. But it's usually the reverse, where a filmmaker makes a film and then you add a soundtrack. And in this case, it was the opposite, and it had a delightful result, and it traveled again from originally from San Francisco to Los Angeles for Pacific Standard Time. And then one of the things I wanted to bring up, I think, which is the most important point that I hope you go away with, is that technology is just a material and it's just a platform. It doesn't substitute for content. And that the artists, in making compelling content, really needs to have a foundation in what makes a strong photograph, what makes a strong story, what makes a strong film. It's not just futzing with the tools. You really have to have a strong concept in order to make something that's really engaging and beautiful and timeless. So my investigation of my work has always been about what is the language of different materials. And here I'm doing the material language series, which is where I actually shot one image, and here it is a portrait of Scott, in 4 different media. So you can see it's a medium format camera on the far left, a Super 8 camera in the middle, and an HD camera on the right. And then here's the medium format photography, which was done by, again, our collaborator, Rebecca Hinden. And I did it in 4 different quadrants of the image, which were then framed. And so you would see a painting oil-on panel on the left, and then a medium format photography slice, Super 8 film, and HD video. And this sort of shows you what the final result is. You'll see Scott walk away from his body because Super 8 film is time-based and things like that can happen. And whereas in photography, his face stays there because it's a moment. But this encourages you to really think about the representation qualities of each one of those media. And there he walks back in. Okay. Again, technology is a tool for a platform, not content. I wanted to bring up one of the tools that I think all of us teach because it's one of the major interactive tools, and it's the software of processing. So the piece that you see that Scott and I made for If So What on the 2 large screens, that was done with film and processing. Miguel Novello also has a piece down the hall, and I'm pretty proud that he's in the show. He's actually one of my students. Oh, and he has a piece that projects up there behind there as well. And he learned that through my processing class. But I think we are the stewards of the future generations of artists in terms of teaching them all of these platforms and coding and the technology behind them, but also how to be wise and smart and engaging in terms of the content that you combine with it. The other thing that I think is really important for students and collectors to keep in mind is that frequently some of the best work you see is during the experimentation period. So when they have shows at universities, you should go see what people are doing, because students are probably, and I think my co-professors here would all agree, the most creative and innovative and sort of out-of-the-box thinking in terms of what to do with the technology and being able to use it in unexpected ways, and that's what comes up with compelling new artworks. I wanted to talk briefly about the future of VR and immersive film. I think the future actually lies in the hands of strong filmmakers. One of the most compelling pieces in VR was not with computer-generated images, but was from filmmaker Catherine Bigelow, who created an amazing film about a year ago called The Walking Ranger's Shoes. And what it does is it actually uses the VR experience, 3D, for you to be feeling like you were one of these one of these guardsmen who were protecting against elephant poachers, and you actually go on a journey with them while the poaching is going on. You hear the gunshots, you're running along with them through the brush, your heart rate feels as if you're right there with them. Probably risking your life because they will shoot back at you. And to me, that is going to be one of the most compelling forms of VR in terms of really combining it with rich, powerful content like film. And this piece, if you want to know more about it, is also being used in elementary and high schools to show how to use VR in artwork. Thank you.
It's yours. So that's wonderful. Thank you both. And so, Rhonda.
Yes. So I'm a late ad, so I don't know that I have slides. So I'm going to do something that's kind of annoying, where I explain to you some of my artwork, but I'm going to be pretty brief about it. So, is it on?
Hold it to your mouth.
To my mouth. So I my focus in research and kind of art production right now is primarily through 3D scans and animations, and I'm really interested in the space as we kind of progress towards this great uphill sweep into virtual and augmented reality, kind of trying to pull back the physical into that space. So I've done a piece where I've taken 3D scans. You can Google search me. You can get some images there. Taken 3D scans of my body and then animated that through like a vinyasa yoga sequence. I've also scanned a male model and then used motion capture data to put movement of my body onto his body, and then projected that kind of through a frosted glass. If you do make it to Art Market, the kind of booth facing you as you walk in, it has a print that I made of a 3D scan of a mannequin that I acquired through the American Apparel bankruptcy liquidation, and then kind of printed, and then a 3D animation where I'm recreating images that I find on Instagram using 3D scans of my own objects and then kind of reposting them on Instagram. So that's kind of a brief overview of what I'm up to right now. Pedagogically, I'm at San Jose State right now, but I've also come through teaching at CCA, at Stanford, and then at CSU East Bay and Hayward. So I'm teaching courses in technology at all of those places, and because of the kind of student body and the institutional considerations, have had to readdress the way that I teach technology pretty frequently for each one of those cases. We can maybe talk about that later. I'm not going to kind of give you the spiel, but it would take a while. But just briefly, at San Jose State, where I'm currently teaching, a colleague, Andrew Blanson, in the back, and I worked with students to recreate a Bruce Nauman installation that was being reinstalled. So it was at one of his double wall corridors. So you stand on one side of the corridor, there's a mirror at the end, they meet in a V, and when you look down the hallway, you can see the other corridor reflected. You don't actually see yourself. So Bruce is actually an artist that I use frequently when I talk about virtual reality, this kind of split of self in terms of the retinal experience and the kind of phenomenological physical body. So it was this perfect kind of segue when they reinstalled the physical installation. It was first installed in San Jose in 1970. Because of disability requirements, they reached out to Andrew and I and asked us if we could recreate the piece in VR. So we pulled in a group of students to create the VR experience of this. And so we had the benefit of kind of having the artwork existing on site physically and across the hallway, literally in the gallery, the VR version of it. So it did this beautiful thing where you got to feel the kind of like both similarities but also differences between VR. And so I think this is a great example. I've worked with students at Stanford who was an engineer CS major. Most of my students at Stanford in the art classes were not artists. They're coming through the engineering department, CS or ME, mechanical engineering. So they're addressing these problems very, very differently, the questions concerning technology problem, right? So in those courses, I tended to push into the ethics of technology. In this case, the student trained he was already creating an AI, and he trained it instead of, I forget what he was originally training it on, but he trained it on recreating celebrity faces. And then we used a sensor, it's called the Connect, which I use frequently in my classes. You can make 3D scans with it, but it also senses depth and distance. It's made for gameplay. So if you're like raise your arm, your character raises their arm, but you can also kind of reverse engineer it and pull the depth data, then recreate 3D scans. And that's kind of what I use in my art practice as well. So when you walked in front of this sensor, the machine created celebrity face. It's almost like you're standing, like if there's a stream of data, you're like a rock in the stream of data. So it kind of like gets distorted, and the faces were kind of horrific already. And so when you would stand in it, it would create these like strange bruises, and it was like horrifying, but also really beautiful. And I think that that's a space that I'm really interested in, that space of kind of horror in front of or maybe the technological sublime or something. that was at Stanford, Nauman. What's another? Oh, another piece that a student that I worked with at CSU East Bay did was we were working with 3D printing, but he wrote his own G code. So it was he was interested in creating a performance of the 3D printer. So the printer would spit out for 10 seconds, just like hover in front of the plate, spit out the goo for 10 seconds, then pull back and kind of do this little dance. And then the nozzle would lower and then kind of just scoot the goo pile off of the bed, and it would just fall on the floor, and then it would kind of repeat. So you ended up having this like beautiful, both kind of sculptural installation with the piling on the floor, but also this kind of really funny and I don't know how to quite describe it. So I think in both of these presentations, we hear like learning a lot from our students and the way like they're addressing technology as digital natives in ways that we haven't been, right? And so the rules that we've come up kind of learning through the sequence of tech and history of technology just don't apply. And I think that that's a really interesting space. So I'm going to back up a little bit and talk just real briefly before we move on. My kind of conceptual interest in this is kind of this framing or like undoing of the framing of reality. So I think as we're about to kind of walk up that hill of VR, AR, augmented systems and reality, we're also in this massive crisis of reality. And I think the elections of 2016 show that we're kind of living in parallel, but maybe not overlapping realities. And if those realities are increasingly created through the media and content that that are delivered to us and largely by AI algorithms, I think we have to really consider what the repercussions of those are. And I think art in particular is really good at answering or at least addressing these kind of what if questions. So like, what are the ways that a technology can fail if it's successful? Right? And so we see Facebook, no offense, Drew, if you're still out there, we see Facebook doing these things that are like, while it's incredibly successful, it's also creating failures in other spaces. And I think arts and the humanities are uniquely positioned to be able to address those types of questions. And I think teaching in the arts, especially artists who are engaging technology or possibly engineers, I think that's a really right place and one that I'm constantly being inspired by and hopefully inspiring the students. So that's kind of my position statement here.
Excellent, thank you. And that's actually a good springboard for what I think is a really important question about teaching art and technology in particular right now, which is the reality of working with art and technology is it is accompanied by all of the visions of how it's going to be, which we've imbibed from science fiction and from entrepreneurs who are thinking wonderful dreams and all the places where we get visions of new technology. So I have a question for whoever would like to speak to it, but how do you bring to the attention of your students, like if you have someone who comes up to you, a student who comes up to you, as I had one recently, who said, I can't wait till we can download our brains into the robots, and it's like there's this belief that this is going to happen, pretty much like that. What do you do in that situation?
Well, I think what Rhonda was saying in terms of when an essential subject matter to be teaching along with the technology and the materials and the content is the ethics, and maybe you could talk about that.
So I think in that situation, you don't want to say no, right? Like you want to take that energy, but let's use speculative thinking and science fiction. Let's think through what are the results if we can download our brain, right? Like asking questions about kind of identity. So are you still you if your brain can be uploaded to another body? Are you still you if if you're just being uploaded to a head that exists in a jar? Are you still you if you at what point do you stop becoming you? And then questions around like material concerns, right? Like, so who's tending the machine, right? And what type of kind of environment does that exist in, right? So take that enthusiasm and then kind of draw it out to its most extreme conclusions, and then that's where the space gets kind of stranger or more terrifying, or possibly, who knows, right? So maybe this is a good thing, and maybe my ethics, because I've grown up during a certain age, don't actually align with where we need to be. But I think trusting the students to kind of find that, and not to stop it, but to kind of actually pull it through.
Well, actually, this, as you responded to that question, it's as if you embodied the idea of question finding with students, as opposed to just delivering a way of thinking about things. And
Question finding is like opposed to like answer finding too, right? So I think that's one of the most interesting places to be with students, is the question finding, because they can ask better questions in many ways than I can, right? Just because of the kind of dynamic, institutional dynamic.
And Scott has actually been working very closely with Mary Lou Jepson, who's on the cutting edge of MRI telepathy technology, and he can probably talk a little bit about why she even went into that.
Yeah, well, I had a couple points to make with regards to that. Well, I mean, one is the first one that came up when you were talking about how to get your students to engage is actually engage in some of the deeper issues. Is that there's actually a whole bunch of well-developed techniques in the futurist community for thinking about the entailments of changes, both to technology, to culture, to demographics, all these things, and how you can kind of project possible futures, some of which are desirable, some of which are less desirable, all of which play out differently based on the initial conditions and what cultural conditions these technologies crop up in. So if you think about something like the possibility of telepathy and being able to use magnetic resonance imaging to see what we're thinking, you know, the ethical questions come up almost immediately. It's like, who gets to do this? Can you say no? You know, what are the entailments of all these possible technologies? And Mary Lou Jepson, to her credit, who's the CEO of Open Water, who's the company doing kind of the ski cap fMRI thing that I showed in my deck.
And formerly the head of Oculus.
Oculus Rift and one laptop per child, and yeah, I mean, she's amazing. But you know, she formed that company in part because she could see that this stuff is coming down the pike, and she wanted to get the ethicists and, you know, the neuroscientists to all be talking about this, not as something, you know, not something that's going to get kind of sprung on us 8 years from now, that this is going to come out next year or whatever. But instead, start thinking about that now, because it's not just this company. There's several companies. Somebody's going to succeed at doing this, and it just has huge ethical implications if, you know, our innermost thoughts are now technologically available to to people having the right technology, and that technology not necessarily being something super expensive and bulky, but instead ski cap.
That's actually a really interesting and kind of like points to the name of this, like, whole, right? If so, what, right? So it's not a question of like if it's going to happen. It's assume that it will, right? Like, let's just assume that it's coming. So then what do we do as citizens, as policymakers, as artists? Like, how do we engage it so that, again, we're not stopping the conversation, but we're redirecting it so that it actually works in a more humane way, and the technology reflects more of our kind of ethical, poetic, or kind of, artistic sensibilities.
And then, of course, I have to bring this up because I do also have a background in law. There are also the implications, legal implications, in terms of there are a lot of laws that are constantly being redeveloped to wrangle the use of this technology, and our students are always going to have to be aware of that so that they don't get in trouble with the law.
So before we open to see if you have questions that you would like to ask, I have one more request. of our panelists, which I wondered if you have any favorite stories about teaching art and technology. I kind of wanted to open it up to just anything that had struck you that you returned to.
So my favorite story just happened, and that was that I was actually giving a talk on professional development, and I ran into my former student, Miguel, and Christine Duval, who's one of the organizers of this fair, was looking for people who had done interactive installation for this show. And Miguel happened to come up to me, and after several years of not seeing him, and I looked at him and I said, you know how to do this stuff. Do you want to be in this show? And as a result, he's in this show. And so I couldn't be more proud that now I'm actually showing my interactive work with a student of mine.
I want to just add that Miguel is my student, too. I think you had him when he came in, and I have him now for senior review. It's just so you know. Scott, your story.
I have one from a couple of my students after taking, getting through most of the curriculum at CCA, went to see the Talk to Me show at at New York Museum of Modern Art a few years ago, and that was a show that was all about interactive technology, some for art, some for design, but an amazing cross-section show, just a really good collection of really influential works. And they came back from that and they're like, Scott, we know how to do all that stuff. They were like, we could see how to do each one of those pieces. And it was just really nice and kind of underscores this technology as a medium or as a material, because they were like, it's not necessarily what we would have done, but we knew how to do every one of those pieces. And I just, again, there's kind of this pride of being able to convey to them that, these things, there's not a deep mystery to them. I mean, once you kind of understand technology and kind of have a feel for what it can do, then a lot of the mystery goes away, and you can kind of say, okay, I've got this idea, I want to realize it, what do I have to do? And it's just like find the stuff to put together to make it happen. And
That's a wonderful story. Rhonda?
God, it's hard because I don't think I have one, but I can use a couple cases from each institution as maybe illustrative of the way that I address each institution. So at CCA, I was teaching in what was it? Science? I think they were I was teaching in the science department, but they were like art and code, like data viz kind of classes. But because the students had to take it, these are primarily artists coming in and getting their science requirements. So they're not coders. They're not necessarily interested in coding. So like the design challenge of the course then is like, how do you engage artists in writing code, right? And so one of my artists, or one of the kind of early light attendants, I would call them, students, ended up like putting together this amazing project for the kind of culminating exhibit. And then because we're connected on social media, I'm watching him now a year later still using the program that I taught him. And that's cool. That's really cool, right?
That absolutely counts as a favorite story. No question.
Okay. I could go on.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Do you have anything you would like to talk to us about? Anybody out there have a question you want to put on the table?
Oh, there's a hand right there.
Hi.
Yes, I'm having a little trouble seeing through the lights, so
really
please speak up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi. I'm interested in what this means in terms of your admission criteria to BFA and MFA programs, because it seems that while technology is just another medium, it seems that some people are going to have intuitive or more natural ability quantitatively to go with the technology. And then, there's some that are maybe stronger in the humanities and, they don't have maybe the kinds of skills that you need to really go very far with technology. And how are you considering dealing with that in terms of, what you're requiring, like in terms of portfolio? I mean, are you now going to then want expertise as measured by a GRE or something more of that?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. And while I don't know that we have it figured out, I think JD has something to say
Well,
about it.
I have taught at the San Francisco Art Institute, which is a fine arts school, specializing in the fine arts and not even any element of design, although it does have an art and technology department. And for many years, I was in the Contemporary Practices program, which is a freshman core program. And then I also taught a year one class in art and technology. And I would say in my art and technology class where I teach HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and interaction and processing, 90% of the people had never done it before. So I guess the short answer to your question is there is no requirement. I mean, in the sense that you learn, and for the longest time, our math department, the SFAI's math department, actually taught math through teaching processing, because you have to do a lot of math to figure out processing. It's not a very hard technology to learn. Most of my students were able to learn it in a few weeks.
I would add just a couple things. One of the big criteria we're always looking for is fearlessness, because the thing that keeps people from playing in this realm is actually that they think they can't do it, right? And as long as they have kind of a fearless attitude towards it, I think they, in most cases, discover that with today's tools and, working from examples and making changes to stuff that's already out there, they can have a creative voice with these technologies even without being, super engineering based or even all that methodologic, or, they don't have to be the kind of people you were kind of suggesting they needed to. And then second, in our program at least, we added a foundation year a while back that helped people who did feel a little bit put off by the medium of technology to come up to speed with it and on it. So I think, I don't know. Yeah.
I would add to that, actually, that one thing to remember is that many students coming into the college at this point in time have not had the opportunity to have any art in their lower school training. And so when you talk about looking at admissions requirements, we really do need to look at interest, passion, fearlessness, as Scott was saying. And I think I would just underline that many people come in without really knowing what they can do or what they're good at. Probably most of them, actually. Do you want to add something, Rhonda?
Yeah, sure. Because I've taught at the art schools at Stanford, where, again, these are students double majoring, right? So they want the art. Usually, there's a very few exceptions, but they usually want the art so that when they're applying for a med school, they have this like, oh, you're also in art, So I wasn't really teaching artists there. But now at San Jose State, it's a really interesting time there. So San Jose State was the second media-focused, technology-focused art program after MIT in the country. And there's this amazing provenance, this amazing history. Because of this kind of, and this is, I think, something that's happening at CCA, this like kind of shift into design, into business. There were separate tracks then made. So design split off, animation split off. And so then the art department was left with this kind of like, what is new media, right? But at this point, we're a really fast-growing program. We have hundreds of students in the art and tech and digital media arts at San Jose State. So what they have is passion and interest, but they don't have the types of what I would say experiential. They don't have the same types of experiences that like the Stanford or the CCA kids had. They just don't. And so how do you teach humanities? How do you teach art history? How do you, with all of that kind of passion? And again, that's why I'm so, I think, dogmatic about taking that passion and not stopping it, not telling them they're wrong, that they're doing bad, but like using some of that. It's like, okay, well, you're making a 3D model of Pokemon, you're wearing a Pokemon t-shirt. What's that about? Right? You know? So like you can bring art history into that discourse, even if it seems kind of pop culture or like harder to access. So just really finding, are you interested in the aesthetics? Are you interested in the design? Are you interested in the kind of fine arts or the weirdness? Like find that thing that they're most passionate about and then use that to kind of bring in the rest.
Great, thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm a design student at Art Center College of Design in Southern California. And I really liked the discussion when it started touching on speculative design. The problem that I face as a student looking into that field is how do I explain that to potential employers, where some projects might not be aligned with their business strategy, but I really want to work for that organization. So,
Excellent question. Like, how do you explain to potential employers if you've been working in speculative projects or things?
So Scott and I both teach in interaction design at CCA, and I teach both in the graduate level as well as the BFA. And I've also, through that teaching, become very familiar with a lot of people from the technology companies like Google, Facebook, because they hire our students. And the best advice that I've heard from those employers is show everything that shows your creativity. Because they really are interested in your skill set, not in terms of how well you can code and how well you can design a page and how well you can make an interface, but they really want to see your creativity. And I actually think having some artistic elements, and I've heard, I think someone from Facebook actually tell a student this, put that in there. Because they want to see how you think outside of the box, and they really want to see evidence of something that's more than, you know, just sort of vocational in terms of in the interaction field or in their field of technology.
I would also add to that, and I think I might have mentioned this question, like engineers solving problems versus artists kind of asking questions, right? So I think great engineers do the same thing, right? It's not just thinking outside the box, but it's like breaking design paradigms, right? Like, so you can be a pretty good engineer and like get your job done if you have that kind of like logical methodology, but if you're able to kind of think outside of the box and then literally break design paradigms and create new ones, that's massively valuable to an employer. And the folks hiring might not know that, but if you kind of frame it in that way and explain to them why that's important, I think that it's a lot easier to see. But yeah, I understand that it can be a challenge.
So, and it makes you a more interesting person.
And you can tell them, okay, Susie Gablik says, neither scientific nor artistic progress are achieved by adding more detail or accumulating more knowledge within existing categories or paradigms. So, I mean, there is really, in terms of the emphasis of moving things along, there is a body of knowledge that suggests you'll have a lot of value to an employer because of those things that you do.
Well, thank you so much. I think we have to close and get ready for the next panel, but let's give these people a round of applause for all that they do for students and art. Thank you. We're going to take a quick break, and then we will do our next panel about the